The surgical tent shuddered beneath the wind that rolled in from the channel. Inside, beneath the glare of lamps and the smell of antiseptic and burned metal, Colonel Malcolm Cummings Grow bent over another wounded navigator. His gloved hands moved with mechanical calm, extracting fragments of German flak from the young man's chest cavity. The shards had sliced through the leather of the flight jacket as if it were thin paper, leaving edges that glittered faintly in the surgical light. Grow's mind noted the same pattern he had seen too many times in recent weeks. The wounds were deep but slow, low-velocity fragments that had already spent much of their energy before striking flesh. Again and again, he asked himself the same question. What if something, anything, had stood between this boy's skin and that exploding shell outside his bomber? Beyond the canvas walls, he could hear the cough of another B-17 engine descending through the clouds. Another crew returning from a daylight raid into the heart of Hitler's Reich. More ambulances in the distance. The arithmetic of war was becoming unbearable. Nearly 70% of the men arriving at his field hospital carried the same type of injury. Slower, tumbling fragments from flak bursts that shredded aircraft at 20,000 feet, or jagged pieces of the bombers themselves hurled inward by explosions. The navigator would live. Others that day would not. As Grow stepped back from the table and peeled off his gloves, he made a decision that would quietly alter the mathematics of aerial warfare. These wounds, he realized, were preventable. The means to prevent them had existed for centuries. Someone merely needed to ask the right question in the right place. Within months, that question would begin saving lives. Thousands of them. The story began earlier that summer, when unprotected bomber crews first entered the killing fields of occupied Europe. On August 17, 1942, the 97th Bomb Group launched the first American heavy bomber mission of the war. 18 B-17 flying fortresses crossed the English Channel to strike the railway yards at Rouen-Sotteville in occupied France. Major Paul Tibbets led 12 aircraft against the primary target while 6 others flew a diversion. All planes returned safely. A triumph that seemed to confirm every optimistic belief about daylight precision bombing. But that safety was an illusion. As the 8th Air Force pushed deeper into German-held territory through the autumn and winter of 1942, the casualty numbers began to tell a grimmer story, one that contradicted every assumption about American air power. October 1942 brought the first comprehensive medical analysis of 8th Air Force combat casualties. Officers compiled reports from every wounded airman treated in British hospitals, searching for patterns. What they found stunned military planners who had expected machine gun fire from German fighters to be the greatest danger. Instead, the data revealed something else. Roughly 70% of all wounds came from low-velocity projectiles, not bullets from Focke-Wulf 190s or Messerschmitt Bf 109s, but fragments of exploding anti-aircraft shells and pieces of the bombers themselves torn apart by flak bursts. The sky over Europe was not only filled with fighters, it was saturated with flak. German anti-aircraft batteries, Flugabwehrkanonen, or simply flak, had been perfected through years of war. By late 1942, thousands of guns ringed every strategic target. The standard 88mm flak gun could throw a shell to 30,000 feet. Each round timed to detonate in mid-air, transforming its casing into hundreds of razor-sharp fragments spinning at lethal speed. Colonel Grow understood the medical meaning at once. The data showed that torso wounds were killing most of his men. Chest wounds accounted for 36% of fatalities, abdominal injuries for 39%. Together, those two regions, heart and gut, made up 75% of all deaths among bomber crews. The math was merciless, yet clear. Protect the torso, and you reduce fatalities. But there was no program, no equipment, no plan. The U.S. Army Air Forces in 1942 possessed no body armor initiative. The idea had died decades earlier, after World War I experiments with heavy steel vests proved useless for infantry who needed speed more than protection. Aerial warfare, however, was different. Bomber crews already carried oxygen tanks, parachutes, and electrically heated suits inside narrow fuselages, where mobility mattered far less than survival. Most of the threats they faced were not supersonic bullets, but fragments that had already slowed, losing much of their energy before impact. Grove's surgical mind connected the pieces. These were not armor-piercing rounds traveling 3,000 feet per second. These were tumbling shards, moving perhaps 500 to 1,000 feet per second. Slow enough, he reasoned, to be stopped by thin steel. The solution lay not in new weapons, but in ancient wisdom.
In October 1942, Colonel Grove did more than collect statistics. He wrote a proposal that challenged military convention. He submitted it directly to 8th Air Force headquarters, a request for authorization to develop personal armor for bomber crews. The document included the casualty data, the wound patterns, and his preliminary sketches of a vest made from overlapping steel plates sewn into fabric. It was a design borrowed from history, one that had protected knights long before the age of flight. Grove had studied the principles of medieval brigandine armor, small, flexible metal plates stitched inside cloth to allow movement while dispersing the impact of blades. The same idea, he reasoned, could be adapted to stop fragments of steel instead of arrows. The reaction from Air Force leadership was cautious, even dismissive. Weight was the first objection. Bomber crews already carried close to 40 pounds of equipment, oxygen systems, parachutes, heated suits, survival kits. Adding another 20 seemed unthinkable. Cost was another concern, followed by production limits, and the ever-present question, would the men actually wear it? Some officers argued that better fighter escorts would be a simpler solution. Others doubted whether armor could ever make a difference at 20,000 feet. But Colonel Grove persisted. He proposed a small-scale field test. Produce a limited quantity, he wrote. Issue them to crews, record the results. Let the data decide. Headquarters finally approved the experiment, but with one strict condition. The armor had to be developed quickly, and it had to be manufactured outside normal military channels. The Army Air Forces had no facilities ready to produce body armor on short notice, and so Grove turned to the British. The Royal Air Force had already experimented with body armor for its own crews, but the results were disappointing. British bombers, especially the Avro Lancaster, had extremely cramped interiors so tight that even a few additional pounds made movement impossible. Their early armor tests were bulky, restrictive, and ultimately abandoned. But American bombers were built differently. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, while still confined by any civilian measure, offered slightly more space. Grove believed what hadn't worked for the RAF could yet work for the Americans. The British introduced him to an unlikely partner, the Wilkinson Sword Company. Founded in 1772, Wilkinson had forged its reputation crafting swords, bayonets, and later razors. Yet beneath its refined Victorian image lay centuries of metallurgical expertise and a forgotten legacy of armor making. In the 1800s, the company had even produced bulletproof vests for British officers serving in colonial wars. During World War I, Wilkinson designed protective steel gear for officers, though its weight made it unpopular. By 1942, the firm was producing aircraft fire suppression systems, but its engineers still understood the language of steel. Grow traveled to Wilkinson's London facility that October, carrying medical charts, casualty diagrams, and a surgeon's quiet determination. What followed was one of the strangest collaborations of the war, a partnership between a military doctor and a sword manufacturer. Grow brought knowledge of human anatomy, wound ballistics, and battlefield medicine. Wilkinson contributed mastery of metals and production engineering. Together, they worked through multiple prototypes, adjusting plate size, thickness, and spacing, balancing protection against weight and flexibility. The final design was pragmatic, not heroic. 3 pieces formed the full set: a main vest covering the front and back of the torso, a separate apron protecting the lower abdomen and groin, and an optional section for specialized crew positions such as the ball-turret gunner who faced upward fire. Each segment contained 2-inch square plates of manganese steel, 1 millimeter thick, overlapping slightly within heavy canvas pockets lined with cotton for comfort. The innovation was in the details. Manganese steel had the perfect balance, hard enough to stop or deflect low-velocity fragments, yet thin enough to keep the total weight manageable. Each tiny plate weighed just a few ounces, but together they shielded the body's vital areas. The combined vest and apron came to roughly 22 pounds heavy, yes, but not unbearable when the alternative was death. Grow insisted on one more feature: a quick-release system. Colored cords and fasteners threaded through the seams so that a single pull of a red ripcord could instantly drop the armor, allowing a wounded crewman to bail out without delay. By early 1943, the Wilkinson Sword Company had completed its first prototypes. The steel plates gleamed under the factory light, small, square, and precise, an ancient idea reborn in an industrial age. Testing began that March. Crews received the British-made vests and wore them into combat. Soon, the evidence began to arrive in the most convincing form imaginable: damaged vests, bent plates, and living airmen. Wounded crewmen staggered into field hospitals still wearing armor that had stopped fragments cold. Medical officers studied the impact marks, finding shrapnel embedded in the steel, halted inches short of the flesh beneath. The fragments had lost just enough speed in their flight from the flak burst to make the thin manganese plates effective. By spring of 1943, word spread through every airfield in England. Crews compared scars and steel, and rumors became proof. The Wilkinson sword vests were saving lives, but success bred a new problem: demand. Wilkinson's facilities were small, and Britain was already stretched thin by war production. The company could produce perhaps 100 armor suits per month, far too few for the growing 8th Air Force. By summer 1943, Colonel Grow began pushing for domestic American production. The War Department approved, authorizing immediate manufacturing within the United States. That decision would bring together an even stranger Alliance and Army surgeon, a sword maker, and soon, one of the world's greatest museums. The summer of 1943 marked the turning point. Colonel Grow's British experiment had proven that body armor could work, but the Wilkinson Sword Company simply couldn't meet the soaring demand. Their factory, already committed to other military contracts, was running at full capacity. What the 8th Air Force needed wasn't a few hundred vests, it needed thousands. So Grow took the next logical step: bring the project home. The War Department authorized immediate American production of the armor, a move that broke every bureaucratic norm of the time. It wasn't a conventional contract, it was an improvised collaboration between military arsenals, private manufacturers, and, surprisingly, a museum. That museum was the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. In 1943, its curators and craftsmen, normally dedicated to restoring medieval artifacts, found themselves designing equipment for war. The museum's Arms and Armor Department, led by curator Stephen Grandsay, became the center of research and prototyping for the new armor program. Their workshops were filled with relics of the past, shining plate, suits, chain mail, brigandines dating back to the 15th century. Now those same relics were being studied for one purpose: to protect airmen in the skies over Europe. Grandsay and his team compared dozens of historical examples. They measured curvature, weight distribution, stitching patterns, and plate overlaps. They concluded that the most effective design was one that echoed the very same brigandine armor Grow had envisioned: a flexible shell of small plates sewn into a fabric vest. In his 1945 report for the Metropolitan Museum Bulletin, Grandsay wrote, "The design of Armor Vest M6, which is the latest standardized flyer's armor, is based on one of the museum's brigandines dating from about 1400. Heavy armor for jousting, lighter battle armor, shirts of mail, scale armor, and quilted jackets have all been examined for useful ideas. It was an astonishing scene. Museum artisans who once restored priceless suits of armor now hammered, stitched, and assembled steel plates destined for bomber crews over the Third Reich. The workshop smelled not of varnish and polish, but of oil, leather, and metal." By mid-1943, American manufacturers were ready to join the effort. Multiple facilities began producing variants of the British design, all standardized around the same principles refined by Wilkinson Sword. The outer shell used nylon fabric instead of canvas, more resistant to moisture and wear. Cotton padding remained for comfort. The plates, identical in specification, continued to be manganese steel, the same alloy that had already proven itself in combat. Production scaled rapidly. The new standard armor, the M1 Flyer's Vest, was approved on October 5, 1943, and officially adopted as standard equipment for all 8th Air Force bomber crews. The authorization order was clear. Every combat airman would receive armor appropriate to his station in the aircraft. It was a logistical mountain. The 8th Air Force was expanding faster than ever, new bomb groups arriving in England each month, each one requiring hundreds of armor suits. Yet, within months, the production line caught up. The M1 vest weighed 17 pounds and 6 ounces lighter than the earlier British model, thanks to improved plate layout and better fabrics. Crew positions received specialized versions. Pilots and co-pilots, seated behind armored chairs, wore the M2 with reduced rear coverage. Ball turret gunners, cramped inside their glass sphere, used the M3 apron, optimized for their posture. Waist gunners received the M4, designed for standing movement. Bombardiers, navigators, and other seated crewmen were issued the M5 groin protector to complement the main vest. The design was modular, adaptable, and most importantly effective. Initial skepticism among the crews faded almost instantly. At first, some complained about the weight, the stiffness, the heat. Then came the missions where armor made the difference. Men returned with steel plates bent, pierced, or scorched but alive. By early 1944, word had spread across every base in the 8th Air Force. Crews who once refused to wear the vests now fought to have them issued. Some even modified them with personal markings, carving names or squadron symbols into the metal squares like ancient talismans against fate. The armor program had moved from experiment to doctrine. By spring, additional innovations were underway. The next challenge, the head. The M3 helmet was developed specifically for bomber crews, offering better shrapnel protection than the standard infantry M1 helmet. It used overlapping strips of manganese steel fitted over a leather flying cap, flexible, snug, and light. The Grow helmet, as it was soon called, could stop fragments that would have sliced through the regular issue. Official studies by 8th Air Force medical officers confirmed the transformation. They examined 1,117 battle casualties among heavy bombardment groups, comparing armored and unarmored crews. The numbers were staggering. Fatal chest wounds fell from 36% to 8%. Fatal abdominal wounds dropped from 39% to 7%. That meant a 77.1% reduction in thoracic wound deaths and an 82.1% reduction in abdominal fatalities. Overall, the data showed a 58% drop in individuals wounded and a 60% reduction in total wounds sustained among bomber crews after armor adoption. It wasn't invincibility, but it was survival. Head wounds still killed. Limbs could still be torn apart. Direct hits from high-caliber rounds could penetrate. Yet the armor had done exactly what Grow had promised. It stopped most fragments most of the time. October 14, 1943. The second raid on Schweinfurt, the infamous Black Thursday, 291 B-17 bombers took off. 60 never returned. 17 more limped home too damaged to fly again. 121 bore scars of battle. The losses were devastating, over 20% of the attacking force gone in a single mission. But amid the wreckage and grief, one truth emerged. Armor had prevented even greater tragedy. Medical officers found returning crews wearing vests punctured and twisted, with shrapnel frozen in steel. Without armor, hundreds more would have joined the dead. Still, the sky remained merciless. Flak and fighters continued to exact a brutal toll. The armor could not win the air war alone. It could only buy time until something else arrived to share the burden. That something had a name: the P-51 Mustang. The flak vests were saving lives, but survival in the skies over Germany demanded more than armor. By late 1943, even the strongest steel could not compensate for one brutal fact: the bombers were flying farther than their fighters could follow. Without long-range escort, formations of B-17s and B-24s were flying directly into the jaws of the Luftwaffe. Each daylight raid turned into a deadly gamble, hundreds of men flying across hostile Europe, protected only by thin armor and faith. Then, the balance began to shift. The P-51 Mustang entered the war. At first glance, it seemed like just another fighter, but the Mustang's range and speed changed everything. For the first time, bombers had an escort that could accompany them deep into Germany and back again. These sleek, bubble-canopied machines slashed through the sky like blades, diving into formations of enemy fighters before they could reach the bombers. What the flak vest had begun, the P-51 finished. Together, protection and range rewrote the odds of survival. By the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force was no longer a desperate experiment. It was a mature, coordinated weapon of war. Bomber crews who had once flown in near-suicidal missions now crossed the channel with confidence. The skies that had been killing grounds were turning, slowly, into corridors of calculated risk. When D-Day arrived in June 1944, the transformation was complete. Thousands of aircraft filled the dawn, carrying bombs and hope over the beaches of Normandy. Grow's armor vests were now standard issue. Every crew member, from pilot to waist gunner, wore a second skin of steel and Fabrica quiet shield forged from observation and necessity. Behind the roaring engines and tracers, a subtle truth unfolded. The armor program had not only saved flesh, it had saved morale. Crews who believed they might live fought harder, lasted longer, and trusted in their machines. Production in the United States had reached astonishing scale. By war's end, factories had built 338,780 M1 vests and 95,919 M2 vests, an industrial miracle that began with a single surgeon's frustration in a tent 2 years earlier. From idea to reality had taken barely a year. Between October 1942 and late 1943, Colonel Malcolm Grow had moved mountains, identifying a problem, building prototypes, testing, approving, and deploying an entirely new category of combat equipment across an army in motion. The speed was almost without precedent. Even in wartime, it was also a model of Allied cooperation. The British had provided the first manufacturing capability through Wilkinson Sword, contributing metallurgical expertise and the earliest designs. Under reverse Lend-Lease, the United Kingdom supplied 9,600 flak jackets to the U.S. Air Forces. The Americans then scaled the design into mass production, adding their own innovations: lighter materials, better ergonomics, modular components. Even the Metropolitan Museum of Art remained involved, refining designs, publishing technical notes, and later displaying the vests beside their medieval ancestors. The bridge between a 15th-century brigandine and a 20th-century bomber vest was complete. Colonel Malcolm Grow continued to innovate. Body armor had been only the beginning. He directed the development of improved oxygen systems to reduce hypoxia at altitude, and electrically heated clothing, gloves, and boots that fought frostbite in sub-zero air. He created casualty bags for the wounded, wind-resistant face protectors, and new ration kits for long missions. Even rest homes for exhausted crews. An early understanding of what we now call combat fatigue or PTSD came from his initiative. His medical philosophy was simple: treat the airman as a complete system, body, mind, and machine. In July 1943, Grow received the Legion of Merit for developing the armor that protected combat crews. The citation noted that his analysis of wounds showing nearly 70% caused by low-velocity missiles had directly led to the design of the lightweight steel vest and helmet that saved many lives and materially improved morale. Less than a year later, in May 1944, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his broader innovations: wind blast shields, electrically heated suits, hand warmers, casualty bags, frostbite prevention, and psychiatric recovery programs. The results were measurable: fewer frostbite cases, better flight efficiency, fewer psychiatric breakdowns. He had proven that medicine and engineering, working together, could change not only how men died, but how they lived. After the war, Grow's work continued. In 1945, he became acting air surgeon for the Army Air Forces, then full air surgeon in 1946. When the United States Air Force became an independent branch in 1947, the medical service still technically belonged to the Army. That changed on July 1, 1949, when Malcolm Grow became the first Surgeon General of the United States Air Force, serving until his retirement that November. He died on October 20, 1960, at the age of 72, a man who had lived to see his invention evolve through 2 more wars and into the modern age of flight. The lessons of his armor program echoed far beyond World War II. The M195 vest used in the Korean War replaced steel with ballistic nylon, lighter but based on the same modular design. In Vietnam, flak jackets improved: again, better materials, same principle. Today, soldiers and police officers wear Kevlar and ceramic plates, descendants of those first manganese squares stitched into canvas. Technology changed, but the logic never did. Grow's legacy lived in every vest, every patrol car, every mission where protection meant a second chance. The Malcolm Grow Medical Center at Andrews Air Force Base still bears his name, a monument not of marble, but of endurance. Because in the end, this was never the story of a weapon, it was the story of a question. A surgeon in a tent asked why so many wounds looked the same and what could be done about it. He saw patterns where others saw fate. He acted when others waited. He reached backward into history to save the future. The flak vest could not stop every bullet, nor every fragment. It was not perfect, but it didn't need to be. It only needed to work most of the time. And most of the time was enough to save thousands. The combined bomber offensive of World War II would claim staggering losses. Over 27,000 Americans killed in action, 9,000 wounded, and 55,000 dead from Britain's Bomber Command. Numbers so vast that each life seemed reduced to arithmetic, but Grow changed the equation. He proved that data could defy destiny, that innovation could save men even when the sky itself was lethal. The vest that bore shrapnel scars instead of human ones became his true memorial. Innovation does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the ring of steel on a surgeon's table, through the scratch of a pencil on a proposal, through a question that refuses to die. That is the legacy of Colonel Malcolm Grow, the man who armored the skies. By the end of the war, the flak vest was more than an artifact of survival. It was a symbol of human ingenuity in the face of mechanical death. It had begun with a single observation inside a cold surgical tent in 1942 and ended as a standard piece of equipment that changed the very mathematics of air combat. Before the vest, approximately 36% of crews hit by fragments to the chest died. After armor, that number fell to 8%. Abdominal wounds once killed 39%, the vest reduced them to 7%. The improvement wasn't theoretical, it was physical, measurable, undeniable. Those numbers changed everything. They altered not only medical statistics, but strategy, morale, and the psychology of flight. Men who believed they could survive flew differently. They endured longer missions, higher risks, and impossible odds with steadier hands. The armor gave them confidence, not the illusion of invincibility, but the comfort of chance. The introduction of body armor changed how the 8th Air Force thought, how it fought, and how it survived. When commanders looked at the casualty charts after the armor's deployment, the change was so dramatic that even the most skeptical planners were forced to accept what Grow had seen from the beginning: protection mattered as much as firepower. For every airman who returned home alive, for every crew that made it back across the channel bleeding but breathing, the principle was vindicated. In the medical archives, Grow's reports read almost clinical tables of numbers, wound charts, impact trajectories. But behind each statistic lay a name, a face, a family, thousands of them. Men who walked off burning aircraft still alive because thin squares of manganese steel caught the fragments meant for their hearts. The program's success rippled through time. In Korea, soldiers wore M195 vests made from ballistic nylon instead of steel. In Vietnam, new generations of armor combined flexible fabric with steel or ceramic inserts. Each conflict layered innovation upon innovation, tracing its lineage back to that October day in 1942. By the 21st century, soldiers carried composite plates of Kevlar and boron carbide light enough to run in, strong enough to stop rifle fire. Police officers patrolling modern streets wore bullet-resistant vests that followed the same ancient logic of overlapping plates. Technology had evolved, but the philosophy was eternal. Identify the threat. Design protection. Balance weight and mobility. Save lives. In the decades after the war, historians, engineers, and curators pieced together the story that almost vanished behind the noise of heroism and victory parades. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art, an exhibit displayed a 15th century brigandine beside a World War II M1 flyer's vest. A small plaque read, "The principle is unchanged, small plates, great protection." Visitors who paused before the display saw something remarkable: the arc of human learning stretching from knights on horseback to bombers in formation. The old and the modern met in steel and fabric. At Wilkinson Sword, the company returned to peacetime production razors, garden shears, tools. But within its corporate histories, it reserved several pages for the war years, for the collaboration that had saved so many American lives. Their records listed it not under weapons, but under protective equipment. In the annals of military medicine, the flak vest program stands as one of the most efficient wartime innovations ever executed. From problem identification to full deployment took just 12 months. It combined medical science, engineering, manufacturing, and bureaucratic persistence under conditions of chaos. It crossed national borders, merging American urgency with British craftsmanship. It bridged centuries of armor design, connecting the logic of medieval blacksmiths with the calculations of modern surgeons. And at the center of it all was one man who refused to accept that wounds were inevitable. Colonel Malcolm Grow had not set out to make history. He had set out to make fewer funerals. He didn't invent a weapon to kill the enemy. He created a shield to save his own. In doing so, he proved that innovation is not only the domain of scientists or engineers, but of anyone willing to ask why. When he retired in 1949 as the first Surgeon General of the United States Air Force, the world around him was entering the atomic age and era defined by power, speed, and destruction. Yet the lesson he left behind was quiet, methodical, and timeless. That lesson still echoes in every field hospital, every armor lab, every briefing where safety statistics are weighed against ambition. The mathematics of aerial warfare had once been cruelly simple. Now, thanks to Grow, those numbers had changed forever. Before armor, 36% died from chest wounds. After armor, 8%. Before armor, 39% died from abdominal wounds. After armor, 7%. Fewer dead, more homecomings. More stories that didn't end in the sky. The combined bomber offensive so costly, so brutal, found in the flak vest one of its rare triumphs of mercy. It did not end the war, but it gave the war a heartbeat of compassion within the machinery of destruction. It proved that even in total war, saving lives could be as revolutionary as taking them. Colonel Malcolm Grow's innovation reshaped not only aviation medicine, but the very idea of protection itself. Every modern vest, every ceramic plate, every Kevlar weave carries his invisible signature. From the trenches of Korea to the deserts of Iraq, from a police patrol car to a rescue helicopter, the principle remains the same. That courage is not diminished by armor, but defined by it. Grow's question, can these wounds be prevented, still guides designers and doctors alike. And the answer, forged in the roar of 1942 engines and the hum of modern cities, remains the same: yes, they can. His story is not about glory. It's about observation, persistence, and the simple refusal to accept death as routine. One surgeon, one sword maker, one museum, and the countless lives that followed because of them. The skies of World War II were merciless. But thanks to Colonel Malcolm Grow, thousands came home who otherwise never would have. That is his monument, not stone, not marble, but steel.